For those of you who are new to us, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about what the Rotary Bipolar Club is. It is an online club open to anyone, anywhere in the world who is affected by or has an interest in bipolar. We launched the club in August last year with a view to attracting new members to this very specific cause-based club of Rotary. Our aims are to increase understanding and reduce stigma of bipolar through Rotary's global network of 1.4 million members and to engage our club members. We do this through organising guest speaker slots, participating in community outreach events with other Rotary clubs, and working on bipolar awareness projects and campaigns. We meet twice a month online via Zoom with usually one guest speaker per month. If you'd like to find out more or join one of our future speaker events, please get in touch at rotary@bipolaruk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our two special guests this evening. Anushka Jones is the Deputy Political Editor at ITV News and co-presenter of ITV's flagship political programme, Peston. Previously, she helped to launch and present The Guardian's daily podcast, Today in Focus, and before that was the paper's joint political editor. Anushka has also covered politics and policy, including health for The Observer, Times and Sky News. Anushka has a close family connection to bipolar. Mya-Rose Craig is a 21-year-old British Bangladeshi ornithologist, environmentalist, diversity activist, author, speaker and broadcaster. Her family's number one passion is birdwatching, and at the age of 11, Mya started her popular blog, Birdgirl. At 17, she became the youngest person to have seen half the birds in the world and published her first book, We Have a Dream, which was shortlisted for the British Book Awards. Mya-Rose's 2022 memoir, Birdgirl, recounts her unique adolescence and the family's struggle to support her mum, Helena, who was living with undiagnosed bipolar for many years before getting a diagnosis. Mya-Rose is currently studying human, social and political sciences at Cambridge University. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end. Please post your questions for our speakers in the online chat at any time. Now, I'd like to hand over to our two guest speakers, Anushka and Mya-Rose.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that introduction, which was brilliant. And I think for the next half an hour or so, Mya, I'm going to ask you some questions, maybe throw in a few thoughts of my own because of my own experience. I have read your book, Birdgirl, which is really, really beautiful. And for anyone watching, a kind of beautiful example of how you could tie together these different issues, being a twitcher and supporting a loved one with bipolar. And with that in mind, maybe just start by telling me a bit about your family life growing up, about your mum, Helena, your dad, Chris, and your older sister, Aisha.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as has been mentioned, my family's very, very into bird watching and nature and the outdoors. And most of my earliest memories are of bird watching as well. And I think it wasn't until I started primary school that I realized that that was strange or unusual in any way. I thought everyone loved bird watching. And it was kind of the thing that my parents worked a lot when I was a kid, and it was kind of the thing that we did on the weekends to all spend time together. I think it was only as I got a little bit older that I started to realize there was anything strange in terms of my mum as well, in that she'd always been someone who was incredibly outgoing and passionate and driven and, you know, all of these things. And she was a lawyer, so it worked really well. It seemed like how she should be. And it was only around 7 years old when my sister ended up getting pregnant very young, and we did a very intense year of bird watching with kind of a lot of not sleeping enough and adventures and all the things that, once you know what bipolar is, you know you probably shouldn't be doing that. And that when I was about 7 led to the first kind of episode of depression that I experienced with her, and the first experience I had of my dad being very concerned about us as a family, and I suppose that's kind of where my journey with my mum's mental health began.
And you're obviously very young.
Mm.
I wonder if, when you think back, what it looked like to you, and if you can remember the first time that you heard the term bipolar.
I can, yeah. So like I said, it began with this kind of depressive episode through the winter, and I think as a kid, to an extent, I don't know, it was very upsetting, but I probably didn't understand the extent of it, in that I was leaving for school at maybe 7 o'clock in the morning, and I'd come back around 3 or 4, and by then she would have managed to get her. And it was one of those things where she'd kind of become a bit of a ghost in the house, and I knew she wasn't quite there, but I didn't know why. Um, and it was just little things, like she used to do my hair for me in the morning, and she couldn't get out of bed to do that anymore. Um, because obviously I was very young, and my parents knew that something was going on. They'd known actually for a long time, which I didn't realize at the time. And in, I think, 2001, Stephen Fry had put out a documentary about bipolar, and they'd watched it and they'd sort of gone, could this be you? But it had been about kind of bipolar 1, which is much more manic, and they'd gone like, no, that's not quite right. Um, and so it took ages, especially in terms of the NHS, to get any sort of diagnosis. They kept telling her she had depression, and we knew that wasn't true. And um, it was eventually they got a doctor who knew immediately when he heard the symptoms what it was. And I remember they came home, and um they told me that she had an issue in terms of mood swings, and I went, okay, that sounds very vague, but okay. And I was probably 8 or 9 at the time. And then like I basically bothered her for ages, and eventually she went, you won't know what this is, but I've got something called bipolar 2. And I was like, yeah, you're right. I don't know what that is. But I went off and Googled it later, and I still didn't, I still didn't understand. And I think, in my opinion, compared to a lot of other mental illnesses, bipolar is so diverse and so complicated that it's one of those things that it's only, or the easiest way to understand is just through living with someone, knowing someone who struggles with it, and seeing how that manifests in real life.
And I want to ask you about the time of diagnosis. But just before I did, one thing that was really wonderful was, and I say this with children who are 5, 8, and 11, not one of them could have done what you did age 6, which was travel to South America and do the most incredible trip of bird watching. I mean, not one of my children would sit still and look out for the incredible birds you saw. And what you saw was that before you even understood what bipolar was, that it had an impact on your mum, that nature seemed to hugely help her condition, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first kind of trip we took to South America was just after that first really severe depressive episode. And I know it was one of those things where they'd already put down the deposit. They knew that if they asked any doctor, they would have said, like, don't do that. But they decided to go anyway. And it was over the course of like 3 weeks. She went from someone who could barely talk, literally couldn't, like, physically was struggling to see birds and concentrate and things like that, to just like, she was still unwell, but she just kind of came alive, and it felt like I had my mum back again. And it was kind of, it was on that holiday that we realized that it was birds were kind of the key, in terms of our situation, at least, in terms of kind of making things work. And that's kind of the thing we kept coming back to over and over again. Yeah, which is why, yeah, keeps coming back to birds for me.
And tell me about diagnosis. Do you think if there had been an earlier diagnosis, it would have made a difference? And did it then make a difference when you got that diagnosis?
Yeah, absolutely, it would have made a difference. I think Bipolar UK has stats on this somewhere. I think it takes an average of like 9.5 years or something like that to get a bipolar diagnosis. It's really difficult. And I think one of the things actually writing Birdgirl, my book, is I talk to my parents a lot about them in their teenage years and 20s. And there are just so many things in terms of my mum. She had so many really difficult periods that, kind of looking back, it very obviously was bipolar. And in some ways, it meant she was able to do incredible things. She's, managed to become a lawyer in really difficult situations and did all sorts of exciting adventures. But she also was really, really unwell. And I think for me, looking back, it was that period after she got diagnosed that we finally managed to get a grip on in terms of what was going on. In the, you know, again, compared to other things, bipolar is very difficult to treat in that it never goes away. You know, it's a mood disorder, so you can't just take like antidepressants or something like that. And so we spent kind of years figuring out essentially the right cocktail to help her. But kind of throughout that, it felt like we were doing something. And I think for her as well, it felt like, I don't know, I suppose when someone's struggling with mental illness, even having the validation of having a label and being told what you're struggling with is real, and you know what your family member is struggling with is real, I think it's, you know, incredibly important and maybe isn't acknowledged enough. Yeah.
And I want to talk to you about some of those struggles, but yeah, it's nice to hear you talk about the positive side of the bipolar as well. I mean, it was my brother who had bipolar, and we had some very, very difficult times, but he was also a kind of musical genius, we used to think, and his art was completely second to none. And I always think we've just got to really celebrate those positives for all the difficulties that we have. And when you got that diagnosis, and you write about this in your book again, and you're young, yeah, you're 10 years old, and you're trying to understand this, and it was really difficult. And one thing that really struck me was that you sometimes found that you weren't being as nice as you wanted to be, and vice versa. Can you just talk a little bit about what that was like for you as a child, and what did you do to support your mum, both practically and emotionally?
Yeah, I mean, I think that whole, like, the most difficult period in terms of this, I really think, was between that first episode of her being really unwell through to kind of the period right after her diagnosis. In that I think, like, it probably, you know, it isn't the reaction people want, but I was really angry and I was really upset. And I, like I said, kind of having a label validates things to an extent. And, you know, I didn't have an explanation, and she wasn't being my mum in the way that I wanted her to be my mum, basically. And it was really difficult. And, you know, kind of afterwards, as I got a bit older as well, a bit, you know, a bit angstier as a teenager, you know, we'd have these massive rows. And because I was so angry and she was so, you know, she was quite manic a lot and she was very angry. And I think it was really difficult for me to come to peace with it. And I think um overall that has been the most difficult thing, because in the scheme of things, she's very, you know, she's as well as she can be, she's very stable. And but I think kind of throughout my teens I almost had to go through a process of kind of mourning who I wanted my mum to be and accepting and loving who my mum is. And like I said, like, obviously bipolar is so difficult, but again, acknowledging that there are positives, and basically for me acknowledging that my mum would be a completely different person if she didn't have bipolar disorder. I mentioned at the start how kind of driven and emotional and passionate and caring she is, and I know a lot of those features wouldn't be in the same way if she didn't have bipolar. And so I think the biggest thing for me was kind of coming to terms with it all. And also, you know, I was a young carer in various ways. Like, I'm really lucky because my dad was just incredibly strong, incredibly supportive. He never tried to put anything back on me, but obviously the nature of living in a house with someone who does have mental illness, that does happen to an extent. And that, you know, can be as simple as like reminding her to take her medication when she needs to take it and make sure she is actually taking it, not like chucking it away or something, or like making sure she eats or doesn't, you know, stay on her laptop till 4 o'clock in the morning. You know, there's layers to it. But I think um again, like, at the time it didn't feel like it was I was in a carer role. It felt like we were family members who were looking after each other.
A lot of your story echoes with I've been talking to the Labour's deputy leader, Angela Rayner, about her own experience of her mum having bipolar. And in the next couple of weeks, we're hoping to raise the issue of delayed diagnosis on ITV. And it's striking some of the similarities with what you're saying on that. I mean, when you were going through that, did you tell any of your friends or teachers about your mum's diagnosis?
No, I didn't really tell anyone. I think partially, obviously, the stigma. Actually, I have a really vivid memory going up to school in year 7, and they had all these posters about, you know, not using words not in their context, and one of them was like, you know, oh, my mum keeps like telling me off, she's so bipolar, and then it was like, don't say the word bipolar, you don't know what that means. And I was like, oh God, no one does know what that means. But anyway, like I never really told people, partially because like I wasn't really ashamed even. It was more, I just totally didn't feel that anyone would understand, and I didn't feel like I had any way to communicate that. And also I kind of, that was my home life, and I kind of didn't want to bring that into the rest of my life either. And so yeah, it never really came up. And um I still think to this day, people who haven't experienced, you know, knowing people with mental illness, it's really difficult to communicate that, which is, you know, just the nature of it. But I do think increasingly, people are more kind of more open about talking about mental illness and all the things that come along with that, which I think is just removing that stigma is incredibly important. Like I talk again in my book about how I think one of the reasons my mum struggled so much with the diagnosis, because it took about at least 20 years, possibly like more than 25. And part of that was, you know, she comes from a Bangladeshi family, and there was literally zero understanding of mental illness when she was sectioned, hospitalized when I was about 8. I remember my Nanu, her mum, literally sent prayer scrolls to put under her pillow to scare away the jinn that had possessed her, you know? Like people knew she was unwell, but there wasn't an understanding of what there was. And so, um, you know, I think that's why kind of open narratives about all this kind of stuff is so important.
And do you think that can be particularly the case, that stigma around minority communities?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think, you know, for a lot of, you know, ethnic minority communities in the UK, there just kind of isn't that cultural, I don't know, understanding or acceptance in terms of mental illness. There's obviously systemic discrimination in terms of institutions like the NHS. And I think out of every like group of the population in the UK, most likely to be sectioned are Black men. And I, you know, I do think that all of these issues are linked together. And I do think also mental illness is both situational and genetic. And so people, um, you know, becoming diagnosed, you know, they might have the genetic predisposition for it, but it can be, you know, life factors that trigger it. And so, yeah, I absolutely think that kind of race and class and gender and all of these things come into people developing or not developing mental illness.
And just that point that you made earlier about at your school, there was a kind of don't call someone bipolar. So that was being used as an insult about people's behavior.
I think so, yeah. There were a lot of yeah, there were various posters. I think this was in about 2012 as well. So this was kind of pre a lot of internet PC culture. And you know, it wasn't even really, there were a few that were insults, and the bipolar one wasn't even really an insult. I think it was, you know, it was kind of to talk about someone who was having all these crazy mood swings. And I think to me, like, because I didn't, you know, even at the time, I didn't have much of an understanding of bipolar beyond it being mood swings. And I think the more I learn about it, the more I think what an inaccurate description of what the illness actually is. You know, and I suppose I'd kind of I throw it more in the arena as one of those mental illnesses that people that's so misunderstood, compared to, you know, I think things like kind of depression and anxiety these days, you know, people get it more. Yeah.
And let me ask you about supporting family members. I mean, for me, I was an adult when I found out that my brother had bipolar, although the delay in diagnosis was almost certainly over 10 years. And as a family member, I felt completely helpless, like completely helpless. We didn't know who to turn to. You know, we often turned to the police as a last resort because we literally didn't know how to get health workers to help us at that particular time. Sadly, in the end, we lost my brother. What is your advice to family members supporting someone with bipolar who's recently been diagnosed?
I think obviously you can read things online and kind of get a almost intellectual, knowledgeable understanding of what bipolar is. But I think one of the things with it is it's so unique to every person that it affects. And at the end of the day, being a caretaker looking after someone is incredibly difficult. And there will always be moments that it's difficult. And even for me, looking back, I think the dynamic would have been so different if it was, my dad, if it was a man in my family who'd been unwell rather than my mum. And there were also occasions that we had to call the police. The one I remember the most is she just ran away once and kind of hid from I think they sent a helicopter out for her because they couldn't find her. And it's things like that. And even at the end of the day, she was very suicidal at some point, and she thought that she was being very secret, but my dad knew. And in the end, he took her to the doctors and she had to be sectioned. And I think to an extent, accepting that there is no magical cure, I think is incredibly important. And I think also caretakers allowing themselves to rest is so important, because caretaker burnout is so, so common and so exhausting. But I guess on a more basic level, it's patience and understanding and love and figuring out how the illness is manifesting in that person in order to help them. Like, even in terms of my mum, my dad and I can tell a week or two when she's gonna enter kind of a manic or depressed episode when she hasn't even noticed the symptoms. And I think that's kind of one of the lovely things about being able to support other people in your life. But yeah, it's really difficult, but also increasingly as we develop more of an understanding, we're figuring out more what can actually help.
Yeah, how I wish I could go back and be a bit more patient or a bit more understanding at the hardest of times. As someone who was a child when your mum found out about her bipolar, is there anything you would say to a parent who has bipolar, who's living with bipolar, about talking to their children to make them feel less anxious or to help them understand?
I mean, the thing that I'm incredibly grateful for looking back is that my parents were communicating with me, at least to an extent, about what was going on, because I think people think children are a bit less observant than they actually are. And, even before anything had particularly happened, I knew that something was wrong. And so, the fact that they had enough respect for me to talk to me about what was happening, I'll always be grateful for. And even, when she was hospitalized, obviously my dad didn't tell me it was because she'd been very actively suicidal, but he'd been like, she's very unwell and this is why. And I think that there are so many moments of anxiety that would have been so much worse if I hadn't understood. Something like a really vivid memory for me is going to visit her in hospital and the nurse kind of locking us into the room with her and sitting outside. And there are lots of things like that. And I think that communication is so important, as well as accepting, I suppose, on both sides, that is how it is. I mentioned earlier sort of that mourning period, and I think, again, kind of the reality with mental illness is that is to an extent the way that things are, which I think a lot of the time, especially with modern medicine, we like to think that enough pills will make someone become like normal again. And obviously that's not how it works. Yeah.
And it's a really complicated thing. I mean, you're taking away someone's freedom when they're sectioned, and they may not agree with that in that moment, and it's a very difficult thing to actually go through. Someone's actually asked a question that I had myself because I didn't know this. What is the difference between bipolar types 1 and 2?
Yeah, I think possibly these aren't used necessarily in diagnosis anymore, or not as commonly. But essentially bipolar 1 is when it kind of manifests more in manic episodes. So I think a lot of, like Stephen Fry, for example, in his documentary, he'd get these bursts where he was incredibly creative and driven and doing loads of stuff all the time, compared to kind of these kind of brief but kind of deep depressive episodes versus for bipolar 2 it's the other way around. It's kind of the depression manifests itself much more kind of with the manic episodes in between. But I think again, bipolar is really complicated, and I think increasingly they're not using that because obviously your brain doesn't really slot into one category or the other. And I think for my mum, for example, she got diagnosed with bipolar 2, but I think there were definitely periods in her life where she would have been far more like bipolar 1. So yeah, which I guess just shows how much stuff has changed even in the last 10 years as well.
I'm totally fascinated by how nature helped your mum. I wondered if you could just reflect on why you think that might have been, and maybe within that, tell us a bit about some of your most exciting adventures.
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, we made an effort to travel really regularly when I was younger, or no, to go bird watching very regularly when I was younger. And there are a lot of things I look back on that it's like, especially when I was kind of pre-diagnosis, it was quite often my mum who was in charge of planning the family holidays, and there'll be all sorts of kind of exciting surprises lined up, like a really basic one. But I remember when I was like maybe 3 and she saw that there were these super cheap uh flights to the Spanish Pyrenees, and she thought it'd be and she, you know, she thought it'd be an amazing idea, and she didn't know why it was so cheap, and she flew us all out really last minute. And then we turned up and we realized it was the start of February and it was about 6 feet deep in snow, and we were kind of stuck in the mountains for a few days. And you know, there was really fun stuff like that in terms of traveling, where you know, it was all quite spontaneous and fun and kind of seeing where the wind blew us. And also a lot of holidays where we just kind of had a crazy amount of activities planned in to maybe like 5 days, and we're kind of shooting around the place. Um, which again I look back on very fondly, even if it was kind of crazy. Um, and I think also there were kind of issues in terms of traveling, especially as I got a bit older, especially in terms of one of my mum's medications has to be kept essentially fridge temperature at all times. And we went on a holiday to Tanzania when I was about 15, and we were sleeping in different places each night, and we had a little cooling flask that we'd keep them in that kept getting really warm, and they smelled of like rotten eggs when they went off. And we kept having to like try and get new ones. You know, there were little things like that as well. But I think in terms of the actual nature, it was always strange to me how tangible, like how obvious the change actually was. Like it was literally in her energy levels and the way that she was able to speak and engage with us and talk. And like I said, even kind of spotting a bird in a tree, like, you know, in terms of concentration levels, it was everything. And I think that's one of the reasons we did keep returning to it, because we could, you know, as a family, you kind of know mentally kind of the highs and lows, but being able to physically see the changes, I think it was just so lovely for everyone involved.
And one thing that can affect bipolar symptoms is disrupted sleep. And obviously, on some of your trips, you were out from 7 a.m. till 11 p.m. And obviously, there must have been jet lag. How did that affect your mum?
Jet lag was a big thing actually, in that um she to this day really doesn't sleep on flights basically, and quite often like her medication makes her very tired, and so doesn't want to take them on flights. And quite often if we're bird watching till late at night, she'll take them, and if we're getting up only like 6 hours later, she'll still be basically passing out while trying to bird watch in the morning. And so there's a lot of stuff like that we have to factor in. That's, you know, she's going to be quite grouchy after we get off the plane, or that she's going to be knackered in the morning. But I think on the flip side, bird watching is quite often a really lovely way to live, in that you're kind of syncing up with the sun a lot. So quite often we'll be getting up at like 5 or 6 in the morning, but we'll be going to sleep at like 8 o'clock at night. And it's actually a really lovely way to live. And I think, you know, we're quite often places with no Wi-Fi or minimal electricity, and we just have each other for company. And I think kind of all of those things are just really good for you, which I guess kind of lines up with kind of, I think everyone agrees these days that kind of modern living probably isn't very good for our brains. But yeah, birds are great for it though.
Yeah, birds seem a lot better than staring at your phone the entire time. Just to say, in a few minutes, I will start putting questions to Maya. So we've already got some, but if there are any more, do please add them on. Just in terms of support your family could have had, I mean, what support do you think families need? What would have helped you?
I think again, we were incredibly lucky, and I think a lot of this actually was to do with my dad kind of being able to kind of very proactively work within what is essentially a really difficult system in order to try and get help. Because although I love the NHS, it's very poor in terms of mental health stuff, and actually especially it's very difficult to get a bipolar diagnosis even compared to other illnesses, for various reasons to that being very difficult to diagnose and being quite expensive for the NHS. But I think one of the things that I look back on that I think was the most helpful was when I was 11 through to 12 or 13 maybe, which I think is also the period that I was probably angriest with my mum, had the most distant relationship with my mum. There was kind of a local parent-child thing that was essentially bonding sessions, doing activities with like groups of other parents and their kids. And it was the first time in a really long time that my mum had had the energy to spend time with me. It was, I was essentially, I wanted to spend time with her, but I found it really difficult at first. And by the end of it, it really had helped. And it was literally doing stuff like we all went to the woods to make a campfire together, or we all tried to do like knitting together or something. It was fantastic. And I think looking back, because there was various other stuff that kind of I was signed up to by the NHS. They tried to send me to like counselors and stuff like that. And I was having none of it because I didn't want to talk about it. And I at the time didn't think it was helpful in any way to talk about it because my attitude was it is what it is. What's the point? Um, and I was just quite a straight up kid, I suppose. And so having people trying to talk about my feelings, maybe very British, I don't know, but having people try and talk about my feelings, I just didn't want to. And which is why I think that activity thing was so important. And so I guess I look back and I guess my point is the as a kid, the most important thing was over and over again, whether that was bird watching or, being forced to hang out with my mum. It was, us spending time together and keeping that bond because we've always been really close. I'm so glad we've managed to maintain that relationship.
Did that opinion towards therapy or support for you change as you got a bit older? Not that much older, but a little bit older?
Not for a long time, actually, because I just like I said, I think my attitude was very much it is what it is. I guess my attitude still is that, but in a much more positive way. And I think I don't know. I just didn't want to talk about it, I suppose, outside of when I had to acknowledge it. I didn't really see what the use was, and I didn't want to think about it more than I did. I think to an extent I didn't think that I had anything to talk about. Which I think it was just one of those things where it depends on the kid. Like I went to some stuff and I refused to talk, I think, when I was about 9, and so eventually they stopped for a while. But I think it varies kid to kid, and that was just not what I was open to at the time. I guess because I was really struggling.
Have you learned to spot signs of your mum becoming unwell? And is there any particular action you take when you do that? And just kind of in breaking that down, are there things you've learned about supporting people in depression, but also during more manic periods?
Yeah, like I said, I can definitely see um when she's going one way or the other, and it's really interesting in terms of we've kind of found that right balance of medication, and so it's really unlikely unless she stops taking them that she'll get really, really manic or really depressed, but she still you know, medication is never, like bipolar is never that thing that you can kind of squeeze into the middle. You know, you're always going to have mood swings within that. And it can be something as simple as like she's working too much, or is getting really irritable, or doesn't want to go to sleep at night, or is, you know, talking loads or something. And you'll be like, oh, she's like heading in a more manic direction, even if, you know, mania is a very specific thing and it comes along with psychosis and things like that. But you can get hypermania, which is kind of a bit below that, I suppose. And you can see that versus like she'll go through periods where like she does get out of bed, but it's really, really a struggle, and she'll only get up at like maybe 10 or 11, or, you know, she's really getting anxious or struggles to get stuff done. And like I said, she kind of doesn't pick up on that stuff, versus as an external viewer, you can see what's going on because we've seen it so many times before. And you know, it can be as simple as, you like during lockdown, for example, we made an effort to go on a walk every day, and quite often, well, none of us wanted to sometimes, but quite often mum really didn't want to, and we're like, no, we have to go outside. Or um you know, again, even if it's really a struggle, like helping her to get out of bed in the morning, you know, it's, or making sure she eats dinner. You know, quite often, again, I was talking about like kind of carer burnout. Sometimes my dad you know, goes away on holiday for a bit, or away with friends or something, and I quite often like sleep in the same room as my mum because she'll like see things at night. And you know, it's like I think we've reached a point where it's nothing kind of really major in our life, but it's just kind of that constant adjustment, and that just kind of is the way that things are.
Thank you so much. I've got a few more from me too, but let me put some of the questions that have come in from people watching. Emma says, I'm a mum with bipolar and I want to minimize the impact on my children aged 3 and 6 to try and make their childhoods as happy and normal as possible. She says, do you have any tips or ideas?
Yeah, I think, as well as, I do think bipolar, unfortunately, is an illness, or not unfortunately, just is something that requires a lot of kind of self-reflection or self-awareness, maybe. And you know, again, it isn't the be all or end all, as well as you are able to manage yourself, and that comes with kind of knowing yourself very well and knowing the nature of the illness very well. And yeah, potentially medication, like my mum's on quite, I mentioned kind of a cocktail, but for a lot of people, mood stabilizers are enough. And I think that, combined with communication with your kids, maybe, you know, that varies on how old they are, but just being like, this is what mum struggles with sometimes. um I you know, I think a lot of the time that is okay, because I think people forget how many parents with, you know, do struggle with mental illness in some shape or form, and it's not the end of the world. It's learning how to manage that and how to make sure that's a positive experience for your kids. And that can be something as simple as like when you're feeling very energetic and outgoing, you can like go on a spontaneous, you know, adventure with your kids in some shape or form, and go and take them to do something they wanted to do for ages. Or you know, it I suppose it's difficult to say because bipolar is so personal, but I think in each, that's such a non-answer, sorry, but like each person's situation, figuring out how to manage that in terms of your kids, while also, like I said, being honest that that is what you have going on.
It was a really good answer, a really good answer. There's a question here about the NHS, and I'll ask you the question, but also just, you know, you mentioned the struggles with the NHS sometimes, and it's 12 years ago now when I lost my brother, but I saw acute mental health services alongside acute physical health services, and was so struck by the gap. The gap was unbelievable. When my brother was in acute mental health need, he didn't see a consultant for a week. I mean, I hope and assume that's much better now. When he went into a physical health hospital, he was seen within a couple of minutes, and then you get thrown out into the community services, and sometimes they're hard as preventative, you know, care has been cut because of difficulties. Janine just wondered, when the NHS isn't available there for you, are there other things that you have found helpful for your mum?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this is why a diagnosis is so important, because after that you are able to you have a better understanding of what resources you really need. And I'll be honest, in terms of our situation, we were really lucky. My mum had health insurance. In the end, after fighting with the NHS for I think years to get a proper diagnosis, she ended up getting it privately, which is really unfortunate. And and so and like I said, she was sectioned when literally on the, without going into it, literally on the day, like on the evening that she was preparing to commit suicide. And it is really difficult. And unfortunately, the NHS is being gutted, and I think it's potentially worse than it was 10 years ago, just because there is no money. And unless someone is an acute danger to themselves or others, there's often just someone else, unfortunately. And so I think that's why charities such as Bipolar UK are so important. Helplines, services, community groups. Actually, I think bipolar is the kind of thing where quite often it's really helpful to be able to talk to other people. And especially if you're supporting someone else, it's very often helpful to talk to other people because they understand. And I think, again, at the end of the day, the thing with bipolar is learning what triggers things on both ends of the spectrum. Whether that's knowing someone who has a tendency for manic episodes, who'll work crazy hours for days on end and doesn't really sleep, and then something happens, or someone who, doesn't leave their house for a few days, like, and unfortunately, the NHS isn't as reliable as we'd like it to be, and as I suspect it would like to be either. But yeah, I don't know, internet, other resources, a support network of some shape or form.
Two questions from Tracy, both of which I want to put to you. One was, how does your mum describe, how does and did your mum describe what she was going through? And also, did the sounds of the birds as compared to the visual have any impact?
Yeah, in terms of the second question, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to be able to cite like a dictionary, but there's genuinely been a few academic studies on the effect of bird sounds on the human brain, and it's all really good. It's all really good for us. Which I guess again goes back to that thing I said earlier, essentially, of we're supposed to kind of be, I don't know, frolicking around in the woodland rather than working in offices. But yeah, so that it's always really, really good. And I think people who have kind of bird call alarm clocks in the morning and things like that is really good for them as well. And I think it's really interesting talking to my mum about kind of those periods of more severe mental illness, because I think in some ways she's far more blasé about it than anyone else is. Like to be honest, I said that we're very close, and there are some things that she's told me that my dad would have been really upset at the time if he knew that she told me, because he was trying to protect me versus she thought it was funny, such as the incident I talked about earlier when she was hiding from the police. And there were various things like that, and but I think also at the same time, anyone who kind of is feeling that degree of depression, especially, it's so difficult to communicate that. And I think increasingly, especially with mania, so I think also it's quite difficult sometimes to communicate that you don't want that to end. Because I think quite often the assumption with mental illness is you always want to get better, you always want to come back to the middle. And actually, when someone's very depressed, they want to kind of almost relish in that. They don't want to get better. And obviously, when you're manic, you quite often feel fantastic. And why would you want to get dragged down from that? And so I think actually, in many ways, my family's experience with my mum's bipolar is very different from her experience with her bipolar. Yeah.
Yeah, and for my brother, the psychosis made him feel like he was connected to the universe. And, his, trying to get the right drugs to bring him down didn't always work. Sometimes he felt like he'd been disconnected from the universe. Ermin has asked, why do you think it takes 9.5 years on average? Why is it so difficult to diagnose bipolar? I mean, just one thing worth saying that we're doing on this work we're doing on ITV News at the moment, we've been speaking to experts about this, and there aren't very many things at the moment that look to diagnose earlier. So they don't, for example, at the moment, regularly track high risk individuals and look for signs of bipolar in those high risk individuals. But there's really good work that's happening where they're trying to improve on that. And we just really, really hope that, governments take that seriously. I mean, if Labour were to win, the one thing I did find really interesting was that the second most powerful politician in the country will have very, very real experience of bipolar. Why do you think it takes so long? Why do you think it's so difficult to diagnose?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you just said. And I think someone earlier asked if bipolar is a genetic condition, and it is to an extent, in the way that it would be possible to kind of screen family member, especially if there's a lot of people with bipolar in a family, to kind of check before things get bad, because it is genetic, but it is also triggered in that people will have it in their brain, but it won't always be set off, basically. So I think, there are ways to prevent it before it, catch it before it happens. I think also kind of the way that we talk about mental illness is very rigid. Kind of there's a set of criteria for each mental illness, but really I think what I've come to realize is that mental illness, like each label, is just like a jumble of stuff together, and which is why there's so many bits of overlap between different diagnoses, because it's essentially lots of different Venn diagrams, and that's how they figure out kind of how to treat it and medicate it and things like that. And like I mentioned earlier, people who feel manic feel fantastic, and unless they're having kind of psychotic delusions, like they think they can fly, or they think they're Jesus reborn or something, like if someone's just being incredibly creative and really good at their job and not sleeping enough and all this stuff, they're not going to be sent to a psychiatrist, versus someone who's going through a very severe depressive episode. People understand what that is much more, and so they're much likely to get them to seek help, which means a lot of people with bipolar disorder are diagnosed with depression, but antidepressant pills actually trigger manic episodes in people with bipolar. So that diagnosis is both wrong, so it prevents them from getting a proper diagnosis, and it actually makes them worse as well. And so yeah, it's a really complicated illness, just because there's so many different symptoms going on. I think actually also the UK in some ways is quite behind compared to the US in terms of kind of understanding and awareness in terms of the kind of doctors as well. But yeah, it's really complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, and Amanda asked, actually, I found this quite interesting. Did you find the depressive episodes easier to deal with compared to mania? And it was interesting when you said about bipolar 1 or 2, which I had not heard of. And I think in our case, it must have been bipolar 1. The mania was much more dominant than, well, dominant than the depression. I mean, to Amanda, what I would say is that we as a family definitely found the mania harder. And the mania in my brother's case could end up with some very, very scary incidents in places that, we weren't there to protect him and help him. But he probably found the depression much more difficult, because with the mania, he was sort of on top of the world. With the depression, we knew he was there, we could control, we could cuddle him, we could give him our love and support. But for him, that was probably much harder. I mean, what about for you? Which did you find harder to deal with?
Yeah, I remember feeling awful when I was younger for essentially wishing that my mum was going through a depressive episode rather than a manic episode, which, I felt awful at the time, and it feels awful to say now, even though I understand that much more. Just because, like, people don't talk about, for example, in terms of mania, it also makes people really angry, sometimes really irritable, really unfriendly. And so I think quite often that, but it was both. I think, again, kind of I was talking about that hypermania between a manic episode and kind of being stable. And I think that's more where you experience that, versus my mum was never really prone to proper manic episodes. And so I never really experienced that, at least during my lifetime. But I'm sure I would have found that incredibly difficult. And so, depression is so difficult in terms of seeing a member of family go through that. It's so, so upsetting. But I think it's easier to understand how you can help someone, and also someone is more willing to be helped. And quite frankly, it's easier to live with them. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's really difficult, but I suppose as a carer, depression is just easier.
We're coming towards the end. Just a couple of quick ones here, and then I wanted to ask you a question about your book. How old is your mum? Somebody just asked now.
She is 56. She just turned 56, and she was diagnosed when she was about 12 years ago now, so like 44. And for context, she started showing signs of mental illness when she was about 16 or about 5, depending what you class. So like obviously that's a lifetime before diagnosis. But yeah.
And just to say, Amanda agreed with what you were saying about mania and depression. She said it was frustrating because mania gets treated faster than depression.
Yeah, it's easier to brought down and go up as well, unfortunately.
So Philippa asks, and then I'm going to bring it to a couple of final questions about the book, or one final question. Do you have a favorite bird, and where would be your top place in the world? Because I know you've been all over to watch birds.
My favorite bird in the world is something called a harpy eagle. It's the biggest bird in the world. I talk about it a lot in my book actually because I spent years trying to see one. They're terrifying, they're massive. They hunt by grabbing sloths off the top of trees. You get them in the Amazon. Absolutely beautiful in my opinion. And my favorite bird in the UK is probably the robin. For the reasons that I think everyone knows, really beautiful, really friendly. I think my favorite place to bird in the UK is like a Scottish off island somewhere, because quite often some very cool birds get blown in off the sea. And I think in the world, South America, just because it's somewhere that'll always be almost incredibly nostalgic and positive for me.
And just a final question for me, and I'm so sorry to those of you who put questions in that we've not got to, because we are now running out of time. But why did you write the book? And when you launched it, were the journalists who asked you about it more interested about your mum's condition or mostly interested in the bird watching?
Yeah, when I wrote, for context, I wrote my book Birdgirl when I was like 18. And before that I'd wanted to write it for years, and I wanted to write a book about birds because I love birds. And it was only when I started plotting it out that I realized the story made no sense without talking about my mum's mental illness. And that was terrifying at the time. Like I said earlier, I hadn't even really told anyone in my life about my mum's diagnosis, let alone the world. And so it was terrifying. And my mum at the time was much more positive about than I was about kind of representation and talking about it and being very open. But I think interestingly, the original wave of press stuff around the book, people wanted to talk about the birds. And I think to an extent it made people really almost uncomfortable to acknowledge the bipolar in the book, even though I think that is essentially what the book is about. But you know, birds, but bipolar. And it's only as time has gone on and that I've made a really solid effort to talk about the bipolar side of things that people have sort of opened up a lot. And I think it's partially a mental health taboo. It's partially because people love talking about nature and travel. And I think partially because bipolar in particular is still really misunderstood. And that's really difficult to communicate in like a 2-minute radio clip. But yeah, that book was terrifying. And I'm so glad that I wrote it.
Well, as someone who's nearly 44 and only just embarking on my first book, I can tell you that for you to have written such a beautiful book at age 18 is something quite extraordinary. And if people want to look up Birdgirl, I think Eleanor has shared the link for where you can buy it in the chat. And with that, I'll say thank you so much, Maya, and I'll hand back to Steve.
So Anushka and Mya-Rose, thank you so much. I'm guessing that might be a harpy eagle.
It is. Oh, yeah, that's a harpy eagle on the front. They're my favorites.
Okay, that's the book. If you didn't read it, the great Margaret Atwood from Handmaid's Tale fame has actually written lyrical, poignant, and insightful as a recommendation for Mya-Rose's book. So yeah, just a couple of bits from me to finish off. Mya-Rose, I love this phrase. Your brain doesn't necessarily fit into one category or another. You make a great psychiatrist. Anushka, when you said bird watching is better than staring at your phone, I love that. And I might get myself a bird call alarm clock if that's a good thing for your brain. So thank you both for providing us with such an interesting and insightful talk this evening. For every person living with bipolar, a further 5 people are closely impacted through loved ones. So it's incredibly helpful to hear insights like these from family and friends. Bipolar UK offers support to everyone affected by bipolar, including family and friends. So if you are impacted by any of the things discussed this evening and would like to find out about support that is available, please visit Bipolar UK's website. Bipolar UK also runs a monthly online support group, especially for family and friends.